"Hey, old-timer, did you get lost on the way to the bingo hall?" The question hung in the humid, stale air of the logistics supply tent, slicing through the low hum of industrial fans and the clatter of inventory crates. It was a voice dripping with the specific kind of arrogance that only the young and elite could muster, the kind that came from peak physical conditioning and a chest full of ribbons that hadn't yet faded in the sun. Lieutenant Marcus Miller stood with his hip cocked against a stack of Pelican cases, his arms crossed over his chest. He was the picture of modern special warfare perfection, sleeves rolled to reveal vascular forearms, high and tight haircut, and a gaze that usually made junior enlisted men stutter. But the man he was addressing didn't stutter. In fact, the man didn't say anything at all. Philip Weston stood near the intake counter, his posture relaxed but not slouching. He looked out of place, a singular drop of color in a sea of olive drab, coyote brown, and multicam patterns. Philip was wearing a simple royal blue polo shirt tucked neatly into beige slacks. He held a weathered baseball cap in his hands, his thumbs tracing the brim with a slow, rhythmic motion. He was 82 years old, with skin like crinkled parchment, and eyes that were a watery pale blue obscured slightly by thick glasses. "Is this some kind of joke?" Miller asked, looking around at his squad mates for validation. A few of them chuckled, the sound nervous but compliant. They were Navy SEALs, fresh from a deployment rotation, feeling invincible and bored while waiting for a supply requisition to clear. They were the apex predators on this base, and seeing a fragile-looking senior citizen standing in a restricted logistics zone felt like a glitch in their matrix. "I asked you a question, sir," Miller said, stepping closer, invading the personal space that military discipline usually held sacred. "Do you even know where you are? This is a restricted supply depot. Civilians aren't allowed past the checkpoint. Did you wander off a tour bus?" Philip finally moved. He shifted his weight, his old joints clicking audibly in the silence that had befallen the immediate area. He looked up at Miller, his expression unreadable. There was no fear in his eyes, nor was there anger. It was a look of profound, bottomless patience, the kind of look a mountain gives to a passing storm. "I am waiting for the quartermaster," Philip said. His voice was soft, raspy like dry leaves scraping over concrete, but it carried perfectly in the quiet tent. Miller laughed, a sharp barking sound. "The quartermaster? You mean Chief Henderson? Henderson is busy handling gear for actual operators, not handing out souvenirs. Look, Pop, the museum is 3 miles east near the main gate. They have a nice little gift shop. Maybe you can buy a commemorative coin there." Philip turned back to the counter, ignoring the barb. He placed a small folded piece of paper on the metal surface, waiting for the young supply clerk who had disappeared into the back rows of shelving. The dismissal irked Miller. He wasn't used to being ignored. He was an officer, a warrior, a man who had kicked down doors in 3 different continents. Being ghosted by a man in a royal blue polo shirt felt like an itch he couldn't scratch. He stepped right up to the counter, leaning his elbow on it, effectively blocking Philip's line of sight. "You know, I'm trying to help you out here before the MPs come and haul you off for trespassing," Miller said, his voice dropping to a mock conspiratorial whisper. "We do important work here. Dangerous work. We don't have time to babysit. Which war were you in, anyway?" "The Civil War." The other SEALs erupted in laughter this time, louder and more confident. The joke landed. It played into the invincibility of their youth, contrasting their high-tech reality with the ancient analog presence of the old man. Philip remained still. His eyes drifted to a patch on Miller's shoulder, a morale patch depicting a skull and crossbones. It was aggressive, loud, and fierce. Philip's gaze lingered on it for a second before moving back to the empty spot where the clerk should be. "I was in the one that let you stand here and talk like that," Philip said quietly. The laughter died instantly. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a retort delivered with venom. It was stated as a simple matter of fact, like saying the sky was blue or water was wet. Miller's smile twitched and vanished. His jaw tightened. The disrespect was palpable now. He straightened up to his full height, towering over Philip by a good 6 inches. "Watch your tone, old man," Miller warned, his voice dropping an octave. "You might have peeled potatoes in Korea or filed paperwork in Vietnam, but you're talking to a United States Navy SEAL. You show some respect to the uniform." "I respect the uniform," Philip said, his eyes finally locking onto Miller's. "I just wonder if the man inside it fits." The air in the supply tent seemed to drop 10 degrees. The other soldiers and sailors in the vicinity stopped what they were doing. The ambient noise of the base seemed to fade away, leaving a spotlight on the confrontation at the counter. Miller's face flushed a deep crimson. This was no longer just a nuisance. It was a challenge, and Marcus Miller did not back down from challenges. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from Philip's shoulder, intending to spin the old man around and march him out the door personally. "Let me see your ID," Miller demanded. "Now, or I'm putting you on the ground and waiting for security." Philip didn't flinch at the hand near his face. He reached into the breast pocket of his royal blue shirt. His movements were agonizingly slow for the adrenaline-fueled SEALs watching. He pulled out a small leather wallet. It was worn smooth, the edges fraying, shaped by decades of being carried in a back pocket. He opened it and slid a card onto the counter next to his requisition slip. Miller snatched the card up. He expected a driver's license, maybe a VA card. He looked at it, and his brow furrowed. It wasn't a standard common access card. It wasn't the blue retiree ID he was used to seeing. It was laminated, simple, and looked like it had been typed on a typewriter. There was no magnetic strip, no chip, just a name, a service number, and a rank that didn't register immediately because of the formatting. "What is this?" Miller scoffed, flipping the card over. It looked like a library card from the 50s. "This is expired. This isn't valid identification on a secure installation. It has no expiration date," Philip said. Miller tossed the card back onto the metal counter with a clatter. "It's trash. You're trespassing. That's it. I've had enough." As Miller reached for his radio to call the master-at-arms, the back flap of the tent pushed open. A young petty officer, the supply clerk, hurried out holding a small, heavy box wrapped in wax paper. He looked flustered, sweat beading on his forehead. "Sorry for the wait. The system was acting up when I punched in the..." The clerk stopped. He saw Miller looming over the old man. He saw the tension in the room. He looked at the card on the counter, then at Philip, then at the aggressive posture of the lieutenant. "Lieutenant Miller, sir," the clerk squeaked. Miller didn't look away from Philip. "Not now, petty officer. Call security. We have a breach." "No, sir," the clerk said, his voice trembling but gaining volume out of necessity. "You don't understand. I ran the service number on the requisition. I don't care what you ran," Miller snapped. "Get him out of here." "Sir, the system locked down," the clerk insisted, stepping between Miller and Philip, a move that was practically suicidal for his career but driven by sheer panic. "When I inputted this gentleman's service number, the screen went red. It flashed a code Z4. Miller paused. Code Z4. He had never heard of it. "That sounds like a glitch." "It's not a glitch, sir. It's a legacy flag." The screen said to hold position and that the watch commander was being notified automatically. Miller looked at the clerk, then down at Philip. The old man hadn't moved. He was just looking at the wax-wrapped box in the clerk's hands with a soft, almost tender expression. While the confusion in the supply tent began to boil, a very different scene was unfolding half a mile away in the base command headquarters. Admiral Vance was reviewing logistics reports when the red light on his secure terminal began to blink. It was a silent alarm, one that hadn't been triggered in his 5 years of command at this facility. A high-priority asset notification. He tapped the screen, expecting a drill or a system error. The file opened. A grainy black-and-white photo from the 1960s appeared, next to a current biometric scan. The name flashed in bold letters, Philip James Weston. Vance froze. He stopped breathing for a solid 3 seconds. He looked at the location tag, Logistics Supply Tent 4. "Admiral?" his aide asked from the doorway, noticing the blood drain from Vance's face. "Get the car," Vance said, standing up so abruptly his chair tipped over. "Get the detail. Now, sir." "What's happening?" Vance was already grabbing his cover, his movements frantic. "We have a Trident 1 on deck. Do you hear me? A founder, and he's stuck in the supply tent." The aide's eyes went wide. He scrambled for his radio. Vance didn't wait. He stormed out of the office, his mind racing. Philip Weston, the name was a ghost story in the teams. A man who supposedly didn't exist, whose missions were still redacted, whose operating profile was the blueprint for the very unit Lieutenant Miller now served in. Vance knew the culture of the younger guys. He knew their arrogance because he had once possessed it. And he knew with a sinking dread in his gut that if Philip Weston was standing in a supply tent without an escort, someone was likely disrespecting him right now. Back in the tent, the atmosphere had shifted from mockery to hostility. Miller felt his authority slipping away, undermined by a nervous clerk and a silent old man. He felt the need to reassert control. The Code Z4 nonsense was just a computer error, and he wasn't going to let a civilian stand there and smirk at him, even though Philip wasn't smirking. "Look, I don't know what kind of game you're playing," Miller spat, grabbing Philip's arm. The grip was tight, designed to intimidate and control, "but you're leaving. Now." Philip looked down at the hand gripping his bicep, the royal blue fabric bunched under the lieutenant's fingers. For a brief second, the world seemed to tilt. In Philip's mind, the supply tent vanished. The smell of canvas and dust was replaced by the stench of swamp water and cordite. He wasn't looking at a young lieutenant, he was looking at a jungle canopy in the dead of night, feeling the weight of a wounded brother on his shoulder, the silence essential for survival. He remembered the feeling of being the only thing standing between his team and annihilation. The patience he had learned wasn't from waiting in lines, it was from waiting in mud for 3 days for a target to cross a river. Philip didn't pull away, he didn't strike, he simply tightened his core. When Miller tried to pull him, Philip didn't move. It was like trying to pull a statue rooted in the earth. Miller tugged harder, confused by the lack of give in the old man's frame. "I would ask you to remove your hand, son," Philip said. His voice dropped the rasp. It was clear, cold steel. "Or what?" Miller sneered, stepping in close, nose to nose. "You going to hit me with your cane?" Miller raised his other hand to grab Philip's shoulder, intending to force him physically toward the exit. The line had been crossed. The disrespect had moved from verbal to physical. Suddenly, the heavy double doors of the supply tent burst open with a crash that shook the walls. "Room, a tent hut." A voice bellowed, cracking with a volume that instantly paralyzed every service member in the room. It wasn't just an MP. It was the base sergeant major, followed immediately by Admiral Vance and a phalanx of shore patrol officers. Miller froze, his hands still gripping Philip. He looked over his shoulder, his eyes widening as he saw the stars on the Admiral's collar. The entire room snapped to attention, except for Miller, who was caught in the act of assaulting a senior citizen, and Philip, who stood calmly in the center of the storm. Admiral Vance roared, his voice filled with a fury that made the supply crates rattle. "Unhand that man immediately." Miller released Philip as if he had been burned. He spun around, snapping a rigid salute, his face draining of color. "Admiral, sir, this civilian was trespassing and refused to identify." Silence. Vance barked, closing the distance in long, angry strides. The Admiral didn't stop at Miller. He walked right past the lieutenant, ignoring him completely, and stopped in front of Philip. The room was deathly silent. The fans seemed to hum louder in the vacuum of sound. Admiral Vance, a 2-star admiral who commanded thousands of personnel, slowly and deliberately came to attention. He looked Philip in the eye, his expression shifting from rage to profound reverence. He raised his hand in a slow, sharp salute. It wasn't the perfunctory salute given to an officer. It was the salute given to a legend. "Master Chief," Vance said, his voice thick with emotion, "I apologize for the delay, and for—" Philip studied Vance for a moment, then a small smile touched his lips. He returned the salute, his hand slicing the air with a crispness that belied his 82 years. It was a movement of muscle memory, perfect and practiced. "At ease, Admiral," Philip said. Miller stood frozen, his hand half raised, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. "Master Chief?" This man was in a blue polo shirt. He looked like a grandfather. Vance turned slowly to face Miller. The look on the Admiral's face was terrifying. "Lieutenant Miller," Vance said, his voice dangerously low. "Do you know who this is?" Miller stammered. "No, sir. He had an expired ID. He wouldn't say where he served." Vance stepped closer to Miller, invading his space just as Miller had done to Philip. "This is Master Chief Philip Weston. He didn't tell you where he served because the places he served didn't have names on the map when he was there. He didn't tell you which war he was in because he has been fighting a war since before your father was born." Vance gestured to the room, addressing everyone. "You asked him about the Civil War?" Vance asked, his voice dripping with disdain. Master Chief Weston was one of the original Frogmen. He was swimming into mined harbors in North Vietnam with nothing but a knife and a pair of shorts while the rest of the Navy was still figuring out how to engage. He founded the selection course that you just graduated from. The tactics you use. He wrote the manual. The rebreather you train with. He tested the prototype. Miller felt his stomach drop through the floor. He looked at Philip. Really looked at him this time. He saw the scars on the arms now, not as wrinkles, but as history. Vance wasn't finished. Master Chief Weston is a recipient of the Navy Cross, 2 silver stars, and 4 Purple Hearts. He is the only living survivor of Operation Thunderhead. He is here today because I personally invited him to collect a replacement for a piece of equipment he lost saving 3 men's lives 40 years ago. The supply clerk, who had been trembling in the corner, stepped forward tentatively and placed the wax-wrapped box on the counter. "Your timepiece, Master Chief," the clerk whispered. Philip reached out and took the box. He unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a vintage dive watch, battered and scratched, but cleaned and serviced. It wasn't a cheap souvenir. It was a tool of the trade, a relic that had seen the depths of the ocean in the heat of battle. "Thank you, son," Philip said to the clerk. Vance turned back to Miller. You asked him for ID. You tried to physically remove him. Lieutenant, you are not fit to polish this man's boots. You stand there with your trident pin, thinking it makes you a god. This man forged that trident in fire. Miller was shaking. The shame was a physical weight crushing him. He wanted to disappear. He wanted to dig a hole in the concrete floor and bury himself. Ignorance is not an excuse for disrespect, Vance snapped. You saw an old man and you saw a target for your ego. You forgot the first rule of this brotherhood. Humility. Vance took a deep breath. Lieutenant, you are relieved of duty effective immediately. You will report to my office at 0800 tomorrow for disciplinary review. Until then, get out of my sight. Miller opened his mouth to speak, but the look in Vance's eyes stopped him. Yes, sir. Miller turned to leave, but Philip's voice stopped him. Lieutenant. Miller stopped. He turned around slowly. He couldn't look Philip in the eye. Philip stepped forward. He didn't look angry. He didn't look triumphant. He looked sad but firm. The uniform fits, Philip said softly, referencing his earlier comment. The training is there. The skill is there. I can see it. But the man inside, the man needs work. Philip gestured to the royal blue shirt he was wearing. You laughed at the shirt, Philip said. You asked which war. Philip paused, his hand resting on the counter near the dive watch. The wars you read about in books are loud, Philip said. The History Channel wars. But the wars that keep you sleeping safe at night, the ones we fought in the dark, they are silent. We don't wear uniforms in those wars. We wear whatever we have to. We wear blue shirts. We wear peasant clothes. We wear shadows. Philip looked Miller dead in the eye. Never mistake silence for weakness, Lieutenant, and never judge a warrior by the brightness of his armor. Some of the deadliest things in the world look like nothing at all until it's too late. Miller nodded, a jerky mechanical motion. Yes, Master Chief, I apologize. Philip nodded once. Keep your head down, son, and check your ego at the door. It'll get you killed faster than a bullet. Miller turned and walked out of the supply tent, stripped of his arrogance, leaving behind a silence that was heavy and profound. The crowd of soldiers and sailors that had gathered remained motionless. They looked at Philip with wide eyes, seeing him for the first time. They didn't see an old man in a blue polo anymore. They saw a Titan. Admiral Vance turned to Philip, his demeanor softening. Master Chief, my car is outside. I'd be honored if you'd join me for lunch at the mess. The new recruits could learn a lot just by seeing you eat. Philip smiled, tucking the dive watch into his pocket. It was the watch he had worn when his team had been ambushed in the Mekong Delta. He had used the crystal to signal the extraction chopper after his radio was shot out. He had lost it during the evac, and it had taken the Navy 40 years to find it in the mud and return it to him. I'd like that, Admiral, Philip said, but no speeches. I just came for my watch. Vance laughed, a genuine, warm sound. No speeches, Philip, I promise. Just good food and bad coffee. As they walked out of the supply tent, the sea of uniformed personnel parted. Without a command being given, they snapped to attention. It rippled through the room. Army, Navy, Marines, everyone standing tall. As Philip passed, he didn't look at the ground. He looked at them. He met their eyes. He nodded. He walked with a slight limp. A reminder of a fall from a helicopter in 1968. But his back was straight. The royal blue shirt stood out against the olive drab of the tent flaps as he exited into the sunlight. Outside, the air was fresh. The humiliation of the confrontation had evaporated, replaced by a sense of restored order. Justice had been swift, but more importantly, a lesson had been taught. In the days that followed, the story of the old man in the blue shirt spread across the base like wildfire. It became a parable in the barracks. The young SEALs stopped mocking the veterans who came to the base pharmacy or the commissary. They started looking at them differently. They started looking for the quiet strength behind the glasses and the canes. Lieutenant Miller was reassigned to a training platoon, stripped of his team leadership until he completed a remedial leadership course. He spent 6 months scrubbing decks and teaching basic navigation to cadets. It was the best thing that ever happened to him. He learned that leadership wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about being the steadiest. A few months later, Miller was at the base exchange. He saw Philip again. Philip was in the aisle with the coffee, looking at the different brands. He was wearing the same royal blue shirt. Miller froze. He considered turning around and walking away, but he didn't. He took a deep breath, adjusted his uniform, and walked down the aisle. Master Chief, Miller said. Philip turned. He looked at Miller over the rim of his glasses. He recognized him immediately. Lieutenant, Philip said comfortably. Miller stood at ease, his hands clasped behind his back. No arrogance this time, just respect. I just wanted to say, thank you, Miller said. Philip raised an eyebrow. Thank you. For the lesson, Miller said. I needed it. Philip smiled. It was a genuine smile this time. We all need a course correction now and then, son. Even me. Philip picked up a can of coffee. You still deploying soon? Philip asked. Yes, Master Chief. Next month. Philip nodded. Keep your powder dry, and watch out for the quiet ones. I will, Miller said. Philip patted Miller on the shoulder, a firm fatherly pat, and walked toward the checkout. Miller watched him go, watching the royal blue shirt disappear into the crowd. He realized then that the blue shirt wasn't a sign of a civilian. It was the color of the ocean. It was the color of the deep water where monsters and heroes swam together in the dark. And it was a color he would never disrespect again. Philip paid for his coffee and walked out to his old pickup truck in the parking lot. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment, looking at the dive watch on his wrist. The second hand swept smoothly around the dial. Tick, tick. He thought about the boys he had lost. He thought about the wars he had fought. And he thought about the young lieutenant inside who was just starting his journey. He started the engine, the truck rumbling to life. He wasn't a hero in his own mind. He was just a man who had done a job, a man who had survived. But as he drove off the base past the young guards who saluted the sticker on his windshield, he knew that the story would live on, not for his glory, but for their guidance, and that was enough. If you enjoyed this story of hidden valor and justice, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about the heroes who walk among us. Share this with someone who respects the silent sacrifice of our veterans.